While I was in the SAS, I was deployed to Rwanda with by this stage I was a patrol commander and had my own team of men. And I deployed to Rwanda with the Australian Defence Force. There were 300 members from the Army, the Air Force and the Navy. And of course myself and my other 4 guys. So a 5-man team. For us it was a challenge because we had a set of skills that, while certainly may prove useful at some point in the 6-month deployment to Rwanda, I really had no idea what we were going to do. And I really tried to develop a focused mission for my team to say, this is what we will achieve as this team on this job. But even when we deployed, I still couldn't narrow that down. I was still a little bit of a loss. About 3 months into deployment, one of my soldiers, a young bloke, a very new guy to the regiment, a trooper, as the private soldiers are known in the regiment, John, we both deployed to a refugee camp called Kabayo. It's a refugee camp that's largely forgotten in military history at the moment, but certainly not by the group of 32 Australians who went there for a week or so. We were deployed with Australian Army doctors and nurses and 2 sections of infantry. When we arrived in that refugee camp, there were 120,000 displaced persons living in that camp, living in squalor. They'd been there for a year after the genocide, most of them Hutus who had run away from the Tutsi army who was now sweeping through the country and was now in power. And there was a battalion of Tutsi soldiers who were providing security to that refugee camp. The idea was that all the refugees were supposed to move back to their villages. All is forgiven. We've forgot about the genocide that you did to us last year. Go back home. But it wasn't happening quickly enough for these Tutsi soldiers. So one day while we were there, they formed up on one side of the 120,000 refugees and opened fire on them, causing an avalanche of humanity off the side of this hill. When the avalanche of people rolled off the side of the hill, the Tutsi army had machine guns set up on the high ground and mortars and rockets. And they started firing into the crowd and firing rockets and mortars and just mowing people down without mercy. At the same time, there was militia, Interahamwe militia within the refugees who were sweeping through the group, trying to keep them around them for protection. But because they were running away, they took to them with machetes. And so you either got shot, you got blown up, or you were hacked to death with a machete by either the militia on one side or the government forces on the other side. And for us, we could do nothing. We had the weaponry, we had the capability, and we had the skills to put a stop to this. But the UN told us very clearly, do nothing. And so for us, it was devastating. We felt incredibly impotent because we couldn't do a thing but stand there and watch these women and children and men being mowed down. I recall I was the senior soldier there, and I guess they looked up to me in some degree, being from the regiment. But I recall bouncing from sandbag wall to sandbag wall to these young infantry soldiers, 18, 19-year-old kids really, whose eyes were like dinner plates, and they were in absolute shock and awe that first of all this was occurring and that they couldn't do anything about it. And all I could do was adjust their focus onto something not quite as gruesome, not quite as brutal, but equally as occupying. But it's a situation like that where you have to, when you are being threatened, as we were in a very small area and mortars and rockets were flying into our base as well, and the army took a good opportunity to fire a few bullets in our direction. Well, you've got to make the tactically sound decisions. And there's no time for thinking. It's your training and it's everything else that you've been doing for all these years must come to the fore, and it must come to the fore in the right shape and form and very quickly. And while soldiers were starting to get into that point of panic because things were drifting out of control, it was a time to stand up and take some leadership, because just as panic is contagious, so is a show of strength and leadership to get people moving in the right direction and to ensure that they are focused on what they can control rather than those things they can't control. We took opportunities to save lives where we could, and that gave us that positive focus to think about. During a lull in the fire, John, my trooper, and I, we ran through some of the refugees to a small clinic about 200 metres away because I thought that there would be that casualties would start gathering there. When we arrived, I saw a site that was more like a human abattoir. There were about 200 people who had congregated in the courtyard of this hospital. Every one of them was bleeding. Every one of them had a bullet wound. Every one of them, and if they weren't shot, they had horrible marks from machetes. Some were laying at our feet in the last stages of life. We had no idea what to do, where to start, and what we were going to do. We were stunned, probably as stunned as what these people were. We started by rolling over some of the people on the ground, the unconscious ones who were near death. Put them on their side to give them a fighting chance to try and open up their airway. The idea being that if they were still alive when we went through everybody else, we would have them evacuated to better care at a later stage. For all the others, we were throwing around bandages to people, trying to get them to do a bit of self-help. And others, we were stopping bleeding as a priority. We were opening up airways. And a lot of people had what the military call a sucking chest wound, whereas somebody puts up their hands, a soldier shoots him at the main part of their body and they end up with a bullet hole in their chest and then start breathing through that hole, which makes breathing ineffectual and, if not controlled, can eventually lead to death. But we did what we could. The main issue for us, though, was that we couldn't do very much. Eventually, when the fighting stopped, the firing stopped, we were able to call in some helicopters and evacuate some people. When we eventually left the camp, we came back the next day. The UN sent a message and tasked me with taking a patrol of Australian soldiers, including John, to sweep through the camp and count the bodies so they could get a gauge on the damage. Well, we had pace counters. Everyone had a pace counter. And we counted 4,500 dead bodies. But we didn't go down that re-entrant where the stampede had gone because I was afraid that we might bump an unexploded bomb or something. I didn't count all those people, so the count was more like 10,000. And what was disturbing, a few months later, I was interviewed by the UN and I saw their report, and their report had said 2,000. So they downgraded my number and came up with their own from people who had never been there themselves. Now for me, it was my first interaction with the UN. I had a very low opinion of them following that interaction, and every interaction I've had with that organisation around the world since hasn't changed that opinion of that group of people. When we came back from Caballo, the commanding officer a few weeks later dragged me into his office and he said, Paul, I want you to take that group of people to go and visit Dian Fossey's Gorillas in the Mist. And I thought, right, yeah, this is great. I'll go and do that. And it was wonderful. We drove for a couple of hours up towards the Ugandan border. We met up with some Rwandans. The idea being that the Rwandan government was trying to reintroduce tourism and wanted to use us as their test dummies, which I was happy with. We wandered through the jungle for about an hour, through these bamboo plantations, and there was a guide already who'd found the gorillas, and he was making noises to our guide, and we eventually came across them. It was truly an amazing experience, and certainly one of those things that I'll never forget. It was a huge group. There must have been 20 of them. One main silverback who was a monster, and certainly had my pulse racing. And all the ladies and all these little babies babies were showing off and doing tricks. Their mothers were belting them, and it was just looking at a normal family. And we were right in amongst them. I had a female gorilla sitting right next to me, staring at me, and of course I was panicking. And then she reached over and poked me with her finger, and I was thinking, oh, don't touch me, because the silverback was sitting over there. He was looking at me, and I was thinking, hey, buddy, I don't know what you've heard, but it's all bullshit. There's nothing here. And look, eventually we got up and left. But look, before we arrived, the guide said to us, there's two things you have to remember. The first one is cover your flash. You can't take a photo of them with your flash. The second one is if the silverback charges you, you have to crouch down and to adopt a submissive position, you know, really low, and nothing will happen. Yeah, okay. So as we leave, I'm up the front. There's a guide in front of me, 9 guys behind me, and girls. The last person was John, my soldier. And we came across another group. It was fantastic. Another small group, one silverback, a couple of females and a couple of kids. So we got to spend another 20 minutes with more gorillas. It was just extraordinary. And we left that group and we must have walked 20 metres and I heard this horrible scream coming from behind us. And as I turned to look, this silverback is up on his legs, his hands are up and he's